In 1859, 450 people died horribly off the Welsh coast near Anglesey. Their ship, unimaginably named the Royal Charter, was returning to Liverpool after a trip to Australia. A quick trip. This was a new vessel, an ironclad vessel, an armored ship, if you can imagine such a thing. What's more, it was coal-powered. Propulsion came not from wind power, but from some kind of large furnace in the bowels of the ship. How about that? Very fast. It made it from Cape Horn to the Welsh coast in just 60 days, unheard of. The Royal Charter carried 371 passengers, many of whom were gold miners returning to England from the colonies, bearing their fortunes with them. Deposited in their pockets and effects, there was gold, but there was also enough of it was consigned as cargo below decks as well. A lot of gold. And on October 25th, the barometer dropped. You may not know what that means, but I now do. I now have an old-timey barometer that I keep in my camper, and I finally figured out what it's for. When the barometer drops, the air pressure outside has just dropped, and what that probably signifies is an incoming storm. Lo and behold, back there in 1859, a very big, angry Welsh storm. The kind of storm with too many L's and too much wind and not enough vowels began stalking the HMS Royal Charter. Captain Taylor was advised to delay the trip, pull into safe harbor at Holyhead, but he thought he could probably beat that nasty old Welsh storm, get into Liverpool before it got too bad. And again, wasn't an old-timey sailing ship. This isn't one of those rickety wooden things floating around. This is a modern, coal-powered, ironclad vessel. But somewhere around Point Linus, the gale kicked up to storm force 10 on the Beaufort scale. I have no idea what that means, but it doesn't sound good, does it? That evening, the wind rose to hurricane force 12 on the Beaufort scale. I still don't know what that means, but it sounds worse. It sounds like it's getting bad for our friends over on the Royal Charter. And indeed it was. The wind changed from east to northeast, driving the ship towards the coast, even with coal in her belly burning like a dragon, farting out the back. I don't know how ships work, but even with that new technology, that new propulsive engine, she couldn't fight the relentless whitecaps driving her into the storm-battered Welsh rocks. So around 11 o'clock, they anchored. But within 2 hours, the storm was so ferocious that it snapped the port chain, and then it snapped the starboard chain. The storm was so strong that it bit through 2 big steel chains. And now the ship was unmoored, just floating out there. And it was battered against the rocks of the Welsh coast by 100-mile-an-hour winds. And for a moment, the captain thought he could steer it onto a sandbank, wedge it onto the land, ground it, but at least be safe. But before he could do that, the vessel capsized. It flipped over on its side, and now no amount of iron planing could save it. It's not so much that the ship sank, as it was smashed into chunks and splinters by angry sea gods. Just as it's not so much that the crew drowned as they were broken against the rocks. Most of the people who weren't shattered to death on impact by the beating, relentless waves couldn't claw their way up out of the water onto the land. They were sucked down into it, drowning in the cold, black North Atlantic. And a few of them might have been able to make it out alive, but they'd stashed their gold into their belts as the ship was starting to break up, only to discover too late that it was weighing them down in the water, yanking them down to their deaths. One crew member, a guy named Guzzy Rougier, managed to get on land and also to trail a rope behind him. Very forward-thinking guy. He got off the ship carrying this rope, managed to scurry on land, tie it to a rock or a tree or something, and then throw it back into this horrible mess and fling it to a few people who managed to get out and survive. But not many. All told, over 450 people perished that night in violent, bone-shattering, freezing cold, watery deaths before sinking into the Atlantic. Only 21 passengers and 18 crew members survived that horrible disaster. Now, back in its day, back in 1859, this was a huge deal. You would have heard of it. This was the Hindenburg of its era, or the whatever ship Gordon Lightfoot sings about and that song about a sinking ship. It's that for this period. If you were living in Britain or Australia, you would have heard of it. Probably America, you would have heard about it. It probably made the papers. Not just because of the human toll, but also there was money involved. There were rumors that gold had scattered up and down the beach at Port Helaeth, and that scavenging Welsh families had picked their way through bloated corpses to pocket the treasure. They were becoming fabulously wealthy from this misery overnight, which was probably gossip. Maybe one or two people found a gold nugget, but it's not like the whole village got rich overnight from this. In fact, it was a sore spot in that part of Wales for many years, to the point that locals would write letters to London newspapers defending their town's honor, saying, "I had been there that night. I heard the screams, and I don't know anybody that got wealthy. I'm not wealthy. We're not grave robbers. This is just sensationalism in the modern media, unlike back in my day when newspapers were truthful and accurate and objective." The whole event was sensational enough that no less than Charles Dickens made his way out to Wales just to see the wreckage for himself. He met with the local pastor and talked to the guy, and Dickens even believed that when he died shortly thereafter, the exertions of finding and identifying all those bodies had been what killed him. But the thing that most impressed Dickens was the lingering evidence of the storm's brute strength. He wrote about how he could see an ingot of gold that had been so savagely battered into the Welsh coast that it looked like proper ironwork. He said it looked as if there'd been a crevice in the side of the shore and that someone had poured liquid metal into it completely, as if it had been ironwork or something. And to this day, people are still finding pieces of the Royal Charter. The last time that somebody found a gold nugget, presumably from that disaster, was in the year 2012. Now, obviously, the lion's share of that wreck can be put at the feet of the storm. We're going to blame anybody. We should probably blame Poseidon, who, like all Greek gods, is a capricious and awful person. But the Royal Charter, like many of the vessels of its era, had a serious design flaw which made it particularly prone to capsizing, dangerously susceptible to bad weather. At that period in British maritime history, cargo ships were taxed based on the size of their deck. So, shipmakers, logically, began constructing ships with deeper hulls and smaller decks in order to avoid paying taxes. I am, in my mind right now, picturing a tea kettle where just the tippy top's above the water, something akin to that. Good for avoiding taxes, but bad for avoiding storms. That system would work very well until it didn't. It's one of hundreds of examples we could give throughout history of politicians devising a tax to raise revenue, but not realizing the unintended consequences when everybody tried their best to avoid paying the tax. We've previously done an episode on this program with Dominic Frisby on the history of taxes, and we kicked off with that with the window tax that occurred in Britain, where there was a kind of attempt to make a progressive tax rate. The idea was that rich people have more windows than poor people, so we'll tax windows and it'll be a proxy for wealth. But what happened? You can guess. People stopped making windows in buildings they owned. Landlords would just quit putting in windows. They would pay brickers to come in and brick up the stuff. The phrase daylight robbery is literally an artifact from this period of history, because the vast majority of poor people in England despised the tax for stealing sunlight out of their homes. Before that, or maybe concurrent with that, there'd been a chimney tax, which, similarly, everybody wanted to get out of it. So what you would do is the government was going to charge your house taxes based on how many chimneys you had. So people would cobble together these chimney stacks. Literally, neighbors would secretly build chimneys that would tunnel into other existing chimneys so that they could just have one smokestack. And what would happen is they would explode. It caused fires. Lots of examples of this throughout history. Now today, they're not as dramatic. They're not as colorful. They don't have weird sea shanty accents or anything like that, but are they that much smarter? The question that we're going to ask today is, how do you design a good tax? Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I'll be damned if I ever drown off the coast of Anglesey. Not gonna let it happen. I plan to get shot by a jealous lover. Today we are going to explore good and bad taxes in what I believe is one of the most informative and entertaining tax discussions you will hear in your entire life. Now that's a low bar, I know. It's precisely why I picked the topic, because I'm pretty sure on a spectrum of podcasts about tax law, I'm about to blow this out of the water. Just like the HMS Royal Charter. So what are guidelines we can discern for crafting effective taxes while avoiding accidentally dangerous or antisocial consequences? Again, most of our taxes today probably aren't going to capsize Australian gold ships on their way to Liverpool, but they might cause all sorts of problems on a macro level for poor people, or accidentally transfer wealth, any number of things. How do we construct tax law that raises revenue, but doesn't wind up making loopholes for plutocrats in the process, or disproportionately impoverishing poor people, or just mucking everything up in a big, soupy mess? In short, what's the difference between dumb tax laws and smart tax laws? It's what we're going to explore today, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Scott Hodge. He is President Emeritus and Senior Policy Advisor at the Tax Foundation, and specifically for our purposes today, he is the author of Taxocracy: What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life. You can find that book on Amazon or wherever you get your books, but do me a favor, go to mightyheaton.com/featured. You can find all of the books we discuss in this program, and if you click the link, I get a nickel or something. Scott, hello.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Andrew.
So let's kick it off with this question. Let's say that you are a fresh, young legislator who's not yet been crippled by the cynicism and anger of the world, and you are looking to create a new tax. You're crafting a tax in your state to raise revenue for a very good program. What are the questions that you would pose to a legislator in terms of what they should consider when crafting tax law?
Have you thought about the unintended consequences of your tax? That's really number one, because most legislators don't do that. They have one thing in mind. I want to enact this tax, and I want to stop people from smoking, or I'm going to put this tax on soda so that we can reduce obesity. We want to put taxes on pollution so we can have people pollute less. Have you thought beyond that initial goal of that tax and what can happen from there? How will it change the way that people go about their lives? How will they try to avoid your tax? What are the long-term economic consequences from that? And we can go on. So we know that all taxes have consequences. Incentives matter, and taxes will change the incentives in certain ways that people will, one, try to avoid it. Two, they will adjust their lives in certain ways, and sometimes very creatively. So if you try to tax soda, sometimes people increase the amount of beer that they purchase because it makes beer sometimes cheaper than soda. You try to tax cigarettes. Well, every state taxes cigarettes at a different rate. So people sometimes cross a border in order to buy their cigarettes at a cheaper rate. Or criminals will get involved and decide that they can import cigarettes at a cheaper rate and sell them at a discount in your local community. All taxes have consequences. All taxes often have unintended consequences. And that's what you should really think about, and how that's going to affect both individuals and the economy not only in the short term, but over the long term as well.
I could not agree more with you on that. Heaton's rule of government, my own, like the number one thing that I would put at the front of every book on policy is governments can mandate incentives. They cannot mandate intention. Yeah. No government in the history of the world has ever had the ability to say, we command you to care about this particular thing. All they can do is dangle carrots and sticks. And with taxes in particular, I think taxes, you're not only, all you're doing is doing incentives. You're either carrots, exemptions, and rebates and so forth, or penalties through taxes. You're not only using those incentives that might have unintended consequences, you're doing it in a way that it's pretty much guaranteed to be a moving target, because it's not like physics where I've got a car and I'm going to change the slope of the hood and that's going to reduce the drag effect forever. So we can accurately predict that forever our car is going to have 3% less drag or whatever. Like one of the examples you bring up in your book of just how clever people are at avoiding taxes is slippers and shoes are taxed at different rates, or I guess the tariffs are different. I'm not entirely sure, but tariffs are a tax. And so as a result, Converses, when they're imported to the United States, they just put a little thin gauze on the bottom so that they're legally slippers. So like that's something that I would not have thought of if I were making a shoe tax, but that is something that someone that stands to make money is going to think about.
I think one of the most fascinating aspects of tax policy is what we call tariff engineering. And that is, you have people that went out, got an engineering degree to be able to design products, and where they spend their lives trying to figure out how to design a product in order to get around a tariff. And so you have Daimler Chrysler and other importers of utility vans importing their vans in pieces only to reassemble them here in the United States to avoid what was called the chicken tax. And this is a tax that was put in place, a 25% tariff on imported delivery vans that was put in place by President Johnson in the 1960s. And it's impacted the importation of delivery vans for the last 50 years. And companies have gone to great lengths to try to avoid it. Ford Motor Company they imported their delivery vans with fake seats in it and windows so that it would look like a passenger van and thus be taxed at 5% or 5 cents rather than 25%. And they eventually got caught and they had to pay a big fine. But that's the extent in which companies will go to avoid it. And you see this with tariffs all the time. One of the unfortunate things with tariffs, and of course this is going to play a big role in the presidential campaign, with President Biden promising higher tariffs and then Trump promising higher tariffs, is that women are disproportionately impacted by tariffs. Women's clothing pays or faces much higher tariffs than men's clothing, to the point that they spend about $2.5 billion more on their clothing than do men, simply because of the tariffs. It's kind of strange because tariffs aren't supposed to be sexist, but they end up that way unintentionally. And so we have to consider these things when we go about trying to tax things.
I think you can also make a reasonable inference that everyone, everywhere, always is going to try to limit the amount of taxes they can by as much as they possibly can. And I say this based on, I have lots of friends that are very progressive that will say things like, taxes are good, taxes are the fee that I pay for civilization, or whatever the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote is. And what they really, when they start talking about raising taxes, what they mean is on other people. Like I say that, I don't mean to indicate they're hypocrites or anything like that. What I mean is, I don't know anybody that voluntarily overpays in taxes knowing that the federal government's going to be such a good steward of their money that it's a no-brainer. I donate money to charity. I would love it if the federal government were so competent and moralistic that I knew for every extra dollar of income that I gave to the federal government, it would make the world better. But as it is, I don't currently think that, and I don't know anybody who does. All of my progressive friends still want to pay the least amount of taxes. It's just that, people at the very top, they should pay more. But they feel the same way.
Yeah, people who go to great lengths to avoid tax. There's a story about the estate tax in my book Taxocracy, in which we had an interesting sort of social experiment in 2010, where the estate tax, which is tax on someone's estate when they die, went in 1 year from 45% to zero. And the following year, in 2011, it would have gone back up to 55%. So it gave a great incentive for people to die in 2010 so that their estates would not face such a high tax. Well, it turned out there's a story in the Wall Street Journal at the end of 2009 about a gentleman who woke up every morning and says, "Is it January 1st yet? Is it January 1st yet?" He was willing himself to live. He had terminal cancer, willing himself to live into that following year so that his estate could avoid the estate tax. Another gentleman asked his estate tax lawyer, "Well, if I go to Holland and where assisted suicide is legal, and I go through euthanasia, will it still zero out my tax?" And he said, yes. So if people are willing to go to that extent in order to avoid a tax, what else will they do? And the book is full of those kinds of examples. But what's important is not only the humor in some of these, or maybe the pathos, but the fact it's the economic lessons that we can learn from these things, the unintended consequences on both individuals and then the broader economy when we all change our behavior collectively. And how can we apply those lessons to our current tax code? Then ultimately, how can we fix our current tax code so that we don't have those unintended consequences?
So let's key off of that. I think you and I are both of a mind that it's very easy for unintended consequences to happen, that there are a lot of dumb taxes. A lot of people listening might infer that you are just reflexively anti-tax, that taxes are evil, you don't want to pay taxes, cartoon character of a Republican, so on and so forth. Is it that you're trying to eliminate all taxes because you just don't like paying taxes? Or are you trying to streamline dumb taxes towards good taxes? What's the fundamental goal you're trying to arrive at?
Well, I'm a libertarian. I would like taxes to be as low and unobtrusive as possible. But I'm also an economist, and from that, we want taxes to have as minimal impact on people's decision making, both in their personal lives and their economic lives, as possible. We want taxes to be what we call neutral, meaning that they're not used to incentivize some people, punish others. They should simply set a level playing field so that everyone is basically operating under the same set of rules. Neutrality is really, really important, and it's one of the reasons why we have so many unintended consequences that we outline in Taxocracy. And so my goal, is to have a tax system that's neutral, both economically, socially, according to our own personal lives, but also politically. A neutral tax system gets rid of the politics that often dictates how we live our lives and conform our lives to the tax system. And that's what we really should have. And it should also be simple. A tax system should be easy to conform with, easy to administer. And then two other principles that I think are important are transparency. We should know how we're being taxed and where our money's going. And then we should have a stable tax system, one then which doesn't change all the time. Our tax system changes constantly. And so you should have these simple four principles of neutrality, stability, simplicity, and transparency. Once you've done that, you've taken a lot of the politics out of the tax code. You've also made the tax code incredibly pro-growth because it doesn't have all the distortions in it that currently lead to so much in both inequity in the economy, but also dislocations.
So I'm on board with all of that. Can you flush out what neutrality means for me? That sounds good, and I probably agree with that in theory, but can you illustrate that with, what's an example of a non-neutral tax? Is it like taxing ballet and giving the money to NASCAR? Is it like, what is the, what is a neutral tax? What does a neutral tax look like?
I like both ballet and I like auto racing, but that's an interesting one.
I would love to combine the two. I would totally go to a NASCAR ballet rally. I would totally go to a NASCAR ballet rally.
Very, very interesting. Boy, we got something there. Well, let's propose that to NBC.
Yeah.
Well, how about the way in which we tax alcohol? So beer is taxed at one rate, and distilled liquor is taxed at another. And so what did the very clever brewers come up with? Hard seltzer. Hard seltzer, which is actually, it's brewed like beer, but it's actually a seltzer, is taxed like beer at a much cheaper rate than, say, Jack Daniel's hard alcohol. So here you have the incentives for companies to go out and try to game the tax system, and they can produce a product that is flavorful and refreshing and so forth, but also at a lower price because it's paying a lower tax. And we see those kinds of things throughout the tax code, and it's the reason why we have another very odd thing is the way that automobiles were taxed in Great Britain back in the day, where companies were taxed or cars were taxed based on the size of the motor. So this very clever company came up with a three-wheeled car with a very small motor that was taxed like a motorcycle. It did have opportunity to fall over occasionally because the front wheel was only one and it would tip over, but it was very popular with average working class people because it was inexpensive and taxed at a lower rate. So when we talk about neutrality, we're trying to take away those differentials and tax things similarly so that people don't try to game the system to try to create products or opportunities to conform to that lower tax rate.
And again, that can totally backfire. It's my understanding that a significant reason, one of my friends lives in Texas. She moved here recently. She hates all the giant SUVs and giant trucks. And yes. I had a listener write in that the reason that happened, or a significant reason, is during the Obama administration, there were fuel efficiency standards that were put into law that penalized cars that were fuel inefficient. Well, if you've already got the motor worked out, how do you make a car more fuel efficient legally? You build a bigger car. Because if the ratio of the size of the car to the engine is greater, then it's more fuel efficient. So they ended up creating bigger and bigger cars in order to avoid the penalty of paying for fuel efficiency. That wasn't the goal of the legislation. The goal of the legislation was make tiny cars, but people figured out, oh, well, we'll just make them bigger, and they're therefore more fuel efficient based on the ratio of the size to the car.
Incentives matter.
So
it's quite simple.
But I feel like that's going to happen every time we ever make any law. Is that it's always going to be games. Yes. It's always going to have people that are trying to get around it. So can you give it an example of a neutral law that works that you would point to as a well-crafted law?
Well, that's very challenging. I would say something like sales tax, if it's applied equally to all products. Or a value-added tax, which is what the Europeans and many other countries have, which is their version of a consumption tax. Sales tax is added to the price of your good at the register, whereas a value-added tax is built into the cost of what you buy. The problem is that most countries, most states, have various incentives. They tax different products at different rates. So in the United States, oftentimes, candy is taxed at one rate, but food is not taxed at all. So a Hershey bar is taxed like candy, but a Twix bar is not taxed.
Really?
Because it has
Is it
flour
significantly healthier, the Twix bar? It's better to give it to kids?
It's a baked good, so therefore it must be healthier.
Right, yeah.
And it's considered food. Then you get into these existential questions of what is candy? What is food? And then the lobbyists step forward and they say, wait a minute, my product is healthy. It's got flour in it. Therefore, it should be taxed like food. Great Britain has gone through this. There was a big lawsuit, that very famous one in tax policy. Oh, there are very famous stories in tax policy.
When you the other tax economists are sitting around a fire at your ski chalet and you're all drinking, hot buttered rum, you talk about this story.
We get all our yucks that way. This one is about Pringles, and again, this is whether or not the value-added tax should apply to food or snacks. And the makers of Pringles said, "Well, no, it's actually food because look, it's processed, and we bake it like biscuits." Because it's not you don't take a potato and cut it up and then fry it. It's made with flour and all this other stuff. And they lost the lawsuit. But the point was, that when you get into these differential tax situations, it creates the incentives to debate what something is, the existential question of whether a Pringle is a snack or whether it's a food. There was a very recent case, again, about marshmallows in Great Britain on whether marshmallows are food or whether they're a snack. And they were determined to be a food because they are eaten with, graham crackers and whatnot. So this is what you get into when you have differential taxation on things and get into this big existential question of what is something.
So this is an important tool to learn, that basically the more complicated a tax is, the more differentiations or exceptions that it has, the more deliberating, infighting, and lobbying there's going to be to avoid the thing. And something that hadn't occurred to me prior to reading your book is just, I'm hypothesizing that the more complicated the tax system gets, the more brain drain you get that just goes from the national economy towards avoiding taxes. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're a really bright kid, you just graduated from Yale, and you're looking to make $200,000 a year. If we have a really complicated tax code, you might get hired by a company where your whole job's just to figure out how to legally avoid paying taxes. You're the guy that figures out, if we put a gauze on the bottom of a Converse, it's a slipper, we're going to save 4%. And that's not helping the economy. It's not I would rather that kid be designing, I don't know, vaccines or electronic equipment or something. But if we have smart people just going into tax avoidance, that's brain power that could be used on better stuff.
The sad thing, Andrew, is that because of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, which created all of these green incentives and anti-climate tax credits and so forth, is that the tax departments and major corporations are becoming profit centers. That the very person you're talking about who came out of grad school with an MBA and wants to go out and do something in the world is joining the tax department so that they can take advantage of all of these lucrative tax credits and then conform their business to the tax code so that they can get those tax credits and have Uncle Sam basically subsidize their business, whether it's making chips or solar panels or all of these other things. We're having an entire economy conform itself to the tax code, which means, just as you say, all of these very smart people are chasing tax credits rather than real profits, and they're conforming their business. We talk about Moore's law in computers, which means the processors get faster every generation. Well, we have too many businesses that are following tax law rather than Moore's law.
You in the book are fairly skeptical of exemptions that are made for charities and nonprofits. Why is that? I mean, I think the average person listening would say, well, charities help the community, and they're intentionally designing their operations to benefit other people, poor people, and whatnot. Whereas corporations are looking to make money. So, good job making money, but we're going to tax you. But for the people that are passing out soup and scarves and free medicine and stuff, we're not going to tax you because you're already doing societal work. What's wrong with that?
The irony here is, Andrew, is that I ran a nonprofit. I was the president and CEO of a nonprofit for 22 years. I raised millions of dollars from people who gave to the Tax Foundation and got a charitable tax deduction as a result. I myself give charitably, and so I take advantage of that as well. The problem is that there are far too many businesses that are very large that hide behind this nonprofit tax-exempt moniker. Things like hospitals, credit unions, utilities, private universities, insurance companies. All the actual nonprofit sector is now really a big business sector. And the number of truly benevolent organizations that you mentioned, it's the Women's Shelter, the Food Bank, and so forth, those are shrinking in number relative to the number of big businesses that are hiding behind this nonprofit moniker. We've got to go in and readjust the whole definition of what it means to be a nonprofit, because there are just too many big businesses that are taking advantage of it and competing against for-profit tax-paying businesses. Credit unions are a great example because now we have credit unions competing. They don't pay income taxes. Oftentimes they don't pay some local taxes, and yet they're competing directly with community banks for the same kind of customers, whether it's for car loans, home loans, safety deposit boxes, all of these different things, and they're doing so at tax-free. The irony here is that there are credit unions out there that are now buying banks. How is that possible? I mean, that's like the YMCA buying Gold's Gym. I mean, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's the kind of incentives that we've created because we are not taxing a certain sector. And so, you and I have been spending all this time talking about the effects of taxing things or people. Now, you also have interesting incentives when you don't tax something. So you don't tax credit unions, but you tax banks. Well, that gives the incentive for people.
Banks are evil, and credit unions are kind of like that Jimmy Stewart character, and It's a Wonderful Life. They're for the but banks are bad. Come on.
They're obviously chiseling you, and they're money grubbing, and these credit unions, well, they're obviously virtuous. No, they're just as money grubbing as everybody else, and they're trying to take business away from your local bank. We're seeing the same thing in hospitals now. Nonprofit hospitals and healthcare businesses are now $1.5 trillion business.
Plus one of the things you mentioned in the book, there was a study that nonprofit hospitals, according to this one study, nonprofit hospitals actually give care to the indigent at a lower rate than for-profit hospitals. So a for-profit hospital will go, well, we're going to actually do X amount for poor people, and we'll write it off in our taxes, or we do it for the press, or we're good-hearted people, whatever the thing is, that the for-profit hospitals are actually providing more social services than the non-profit hospitals.
Yeah, how does that make sense? It doesn't. And, the reason that nonprofit hospitals are given that tax exemption obviously goes back into the late 1800s and early 1900s when all we had was charity hospitals, and that was why we didn't tax them, is because they were supposed to do good like that. Well, they've taken advantage of that over the years, and as a result, they are just as profit-oriented as the big businesses. The largest nonprofit in the United States now is Kaiser Permanente.
Wait, hold on. The health insurance company? I just want to be clear on this. You know how everyone hates health insurance companies with the exception of about 20% of the people that are management at health insurance companies, but everyone else in America, me included, despises health insurance companies. The largest nonprofit in the United States is Kaiser Permanente, a health insurance company.
$100 billion a year operation, tax-free.
How? Okay, so is the
how is that allowed?
Simple question. Is basically the difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is just dividends? Like a for-profit has stocks and dividends, a nonprofit just pays it out in salaries. What's the actual functional difference? Is that it?
Well, yes. There are a couple of rules that are in place here. One, a nonprofit can't distribute profits to either owners or a single individual or a shareholder or so forth.
Got it.
They have to retain those earnings and put it back in the business, and that oftentimes goes to salaries, overhead, and other things. But then you get a lot of these for-profit or these nonprofits like hospitals buying for-profit entities, whether it's doctors' clinics or X-ray companies, etc. So it's really weird to see all these nonprofit hospitals that own for-profit businesses as subsidiaries.
And the for-profit hospitals don't get absorbed into the nonprofit model. They're still functioning as a for-profit. They still have dividends and things. They just pay the dividends to the nonprofit.
Right.
Wow.
Yes, that's exactly right. But you also get oddities like in local communities where the local nonprofit hospital will buy a for-profit hospital. And since nonprofit hospitals don't pay property taxes, that new nonprofit hospital that's been purchased will no longer pay property taxes to the local community. So this ends up pirating property taxes and other taxes from local communities as well. It's completely unfair, and we've allowed this to happen. And over the last century plus, in which we've had nonprofit entities, they have continued to grow and grow and grow. And most of their businesses, or much of their income, comes from business-related revenue streams, not charitable deductions. The NCAA, which puts on March Madness, gets $1 billion a year in TV revenues and pays zero tax.
Wait, hold on. The NCAA's nonprofit too?
Yes.
Wait, like the basketball thing, the basketball organization,
yeah, the basketball
with the teams.
Yeah.
That's nonprofit,
right?
Yeah,
nonprofit.
Okay. Part of this is I think that there is a. I'm going to go on my rant here for a minute. I don't think medieval economics ever went away. I think Aquinan philosophy of just price theory is still the default position for most human beings on the planet, included in America. And part of that idea is that we have the ability as a society to point at particular sectors and go, you're not allowed to be self-interested. We put a wand on you. Ba-doo, you're no longer self-interested. And it is completely wrong. Like the basic tectonic plates of that, for people unfamiliar with this, the Roman Catholic Church was a nonprofit throughout the Middle Ages, but it had a lot of money during the Middle Ages.
Yeah, sure
and so,
did. Yeah.
Kaiser Permanente and the NCAA are great examples of this. We shouldn't even say nonprofit. We should just say non-dividend companies that don't have dividends instead of because nonprofit implies that everybody there. I'm sure there are lovely, lovely people working in a number of charities. I'm not counterbalancing that, but let's say me and a bunch of my friends in podcasting. It sounds like since I'm a sole proprietor, I couldn't form a nonprofit. But if I were forming a podcast network based on everything you're telling me, what I would immediately do is incorporate it as a 501c3 and an educational outfit. And I'd claim that we're not a corporation. We're promoting all the stuff I'm currently doing on this program of making the world kinder and smarter. I would keep doing, but we're doing it for good people reasons as opposed for money grubbing reasons. Then we'd go compete with the other podcast networks and devour them. That won't happen because podcasting's not that lucrative, but still.
I won't tell anybody.
Yeah.
But the Academy Awards, which I'm sure you sit down and
watch
every year.
Are they nonprofit too?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, they're actually not a 501c3. They're considered a business league of sorts. They're 501c6, but they get $135 million a year in TV rights. That is essentially tax exempt.
Oh my God, this is a great scam. What we need to do is just instead of making nonprofit outlawing nonprofits, we just need to expand the term to make everyone in America a nonprofit. Just like pass out literature to where everybody's a nonprofit. That's how we're going to get past this. Would you? My solution is just expand. Everyone's now a nonprofit. Congratulations. That's my.
Well, and that would be a neutral tax system. Don't tax anybody.
So you're rapidly convincing me that this is a bullshit distinction used as a fig leaf for very smart tax avoiders. Right. It would not be popular to say start taxing churches in Middle America, but they're nonprofits and a lot of them do really, really good charitable work. Alcoholics Anonymous. I have really good thoughts on Salvation Army. All those things. Would you tax all of those organizations?
No, in fact, I have a paper coming out shortly from the Tax Foundation looking at the tax-exempt nonprofit sector and trying to come up with some simple rules that distinguish between your truly benevolent organizations and these more commercial operations that are masquerading as nonprofits. And I do think that we can come up with a set of rules that do that. And effectively, what I'm recommending is taxing the business income of nonprofits at the same rate that you would a traditional corporation. And then, based on the kind of rules that I'm proposing, you isolate the charitable income of those benevolent organizations so that they continue to do the work that they do, but not get thrown into the mix with these large commercial operations.
So in a very simplistic terms, because I'm sure this gets really complicated, theoretically, if I am a nonprofit hospital, you would figure out how to isolate the emergency clinic that we give for free to the community and exempt that. But our subsidiary that we purchased down the street of the doctor's clinic that's for profit and pays taxes, the money we're getting from that would just be taxable income.
But even the hospital itself would pay income tax because most of the income that it gets from insurance payments, Medicaid, Medicare, individual payments for their health and their doctor bills, all of that should be taxable income. What they shouldn't be taxed on is the charitable gift that they get from people like ourselves who would give to a charitable hospital for various reasons. And a lot of people do, but it's a very, very small fraction of the total income for most of these hospitals.
Yeah, it was
most of their income is business related.
Yeah, you say in the book, I don't have the figure in front of me, but it's like 7 to 10% that's actually just donations from people like you and me that so it'd kind of be like if let's say the Austin Presbyterian Church, you're not taxing when people put money in the hat, and that's going to poor people. But if the Austin Presbyterian Church owns the coffee shop and makes money off the coffee shop, that bit you're going to tax. Like when they're engaging in commerce of selling goods and services, that's taxable income. When it's donations if they owned an apartment building nearby, or they owned some sort of commercial business, or they were. In fact, this is what sparked some legislation back in the 1950s when New York University had acquired a pasta-making company, Mueller Pasta, and they were going to benefit from the sale of macaroni in helping fund the university. And a lot of people said, whoa, this has gone too far. And so they tried to create some rules to tax the unrelated business income of nonprofits. But unfortunately, these rules are so porous and so generous that that you can get the credit unions and you can get the hospitals and so forth that are making billions and billions of dollars and pay no income taxes because of the loopholes in these various rules. Well, let's keep exploring some of these weaponized loopholes. What is SALT? What does that stand for?
Yes, it's not something that you put on your food. It's the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as SALT. And prior to the 2017 tax reform, people could deduct all of their state and local taxes from their income taxes. And it largely benefited wealthier people because they pay more.
Pause you immediately. That sounds asinine to me right off the bat. So if I as a taxpayer can deduct my state and local taxes from my federal taxes, then I'm not actually paying state and local taxes because I'm able to get all that money back on the federal end. That means that other states are paying my state and local taxes, right? Am I reading that correct?
Effectively, that's right, especially if you live in a high-tax state like California or New York or Illinois or New Jersey or Connecticut, where especially things like property taxes are extraordinarily high. This is a way for states, especially high-tax states, to pass on that burden to the federal government and to have the federal government effectively subsidize their high tax burden. Well, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act put a cap on that of $10,000 and said, that's it. Your total SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction, is now limited to $10,000. Well, many people in like New Jersey and New York and California have property tax bills that are larger than $10,000, not to mention their income taxes and other things. So they're squawking like crazy that their ability to pass on their tax burden to Washington has been limited.
Because they actually have to pay for the taxes that they want now? Like they actually have to pay taxes? I'm tiny violin.
Darn the luck. Yeah, exactly. Mini violin. And states are having to figure out how to avoid doing that. And, if you listen to the politicians in New Jersey and New York, they're squawking like crazy. They want to lift this cap so that they can continue to pass on their tax burden to Uncle Sam. I believe that we should eliminate it altogether. You shouldn't be able to have Uncle Sam subsidize state and local taxes. You shouldn't get that deduction. And state politicians are going to have to take ownership over the level of taxation that they charge on their local communities.
Yeah, that one irritates me profoundly because that seems just contravened to the whole idea of the laboratory of democracy and federalism. So like I'm in Texas right now, which is a low tax state. California is a high tax state. And like if they're doing good stuff, maybe we should emulate it in Texas. But also, if they're doing dumb stuff, maybe they should emulate Texas. Like, nothing's a foregone conclusion for me. But if you have a high tax state where the taxpayers don't actually bear the brunt of the taxes, then there's no trade-off. There's no actual decision-making process that needs to happen. If you were a legislator, why wouldn't you crank up the local and state taxes? Because your people aren't actually paying it. Just it's coming from everyone else in the country or through the national debt through federal subsidies.
And local governments, state governments have been very, very adept at shaping their tax system to maximize the amount of tax subsidy or tax burden that they can shift to Washington. For instance, the more you shift to high-income people, the most of the people who actually do itemize their taxes, the more you can shift that tax burden to Washington. The higher you push your property taxes has two things. One, you're again pushing that tax onto higher-income people, but you're also allowing communities to essentially, I don't know what you might call it, redline themselves, where they're using property taxes to keep out the riffraff. And so, you create these incentives for communities to essentially raise taxes for various purposes. One is to keep out people they don't want, and then is to shift as much of the burden to Uncle Sam as you possibly can.
How does that work? If I'm a poor person moving into a rich person neighborhood and there's high property taxes, but I can just write them off on my federal, is the idea that for people that don't pay enough money to get a rebate in federal taxes, that it would ice them out?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there's a couple studies that have been done on how communities have used high property taxes to keep out minorities, essentially creating these little enclaves of wealthy people by using their property taxes. And it's really fascinating. Now, I would never have thought about it, but again, this is the incentives that get created when you allow state and local governments to use the federal tax code to shift their burden to Washington rather than take responsibility for it themselves.
Because nobody wants to pay taxes ever, including people that are in favor of high taxes. Well, let's stick on property for a moment. Mortgage interest deductions. What do you make of those?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that, politicians really want to help people buy homes. And this goes back. We mentioned Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life and the desire to incentivize people to buy their own homes and whatnot. And so we've created this tax deduction in the code for our mortgage interest deduction. The idea is to make purchasing a home, and especially borrowing to purchase a home, more affordable. Well, unfortunately, it backfires. It actually doesn't do what it says it's going to do because the deduction, the amount of the deduction, gets built into the price of the home.
Yeah.
So it actually makes homes more expensive and less affordable. And especially in high-cost areas like Washington, D.C., where you have a lot of competition for homes, the homes get more expensive, the mortgage interest gets higher and built into the price, and thus locking and freezing people out of buying their first home. And so there's a lot of research that's been done showing that the mortgage interest deduction makes homes more expensive and less affordable rather than more affordable and more housing. And so we have this crazy incentive, but it's so politically popular that it's going to be hard to eliminate it. Number one, because folks like myself that, take advantage of it. But also politicians have this sort of mythology around it that we're actually doing good by it.
Yeah.
If we eliminated it, housing prices would go down, there'd be more competition and be more affordable. And the same principle applies to making college more affordable. We've created, various tax credits and deductions in order to reduce the cost of tuition and make college more affordable. Universities know this, and so they are setting the price of tuition and adjusting it to the value of those deductions. And so they're capturing that tax credit and actually pocketing that money rather than actually making college more affordable. And the auto companies are doing the same thing with the tax credits for electric vehicles. They simply pocket the value of that credit by setting the price of the vehicle at such a rate in which they're going to get the benefit, not you, the buyer. And we get this, I don't know, we get this image from politicians. Well, look, we're making electric vehicles more affordable. Well, they're not really. You're not actually getting a lower price from it because it's all sort of, it's like going into
captured by the company.
It's going into Neiman Marcus with a 10% off discount. You're still paying high prices. You just feel a little bit better because you got that discount.
Yeah, I think all of those fall under the broad category of misidentifying the problem as a demand problem rather than a supply problem. So the mental model that I have, which weirdly enough I learned from a Marxist friend of mine, is if you imagine that there's a bidding system, where people are going to an auctioneer and there are 10 people that want to purchase 5 cars. 5 of the people that want to purchase a car aren't going to get a car. They're going to get bid out very quickly. And so the government comes in and goes, these poor 5 people that are carless, what we're going to do is give everybody $400 in car purchasing credit that they can use to purchase automobiles. So you repeat this process. There's still only 5 cars. There's 10 people. What's going to happen? Well, the people that are already going to get the cars are just going to bid it up by $300. And the people that don't get the cars don't get to use that money. They don't get to keep it. So all that's happened is that you're just bidding up the prices. The people purchasing the cars don't really benefit from it. The people selling the cars benefit from it. And so when we have situations like housing, where we don't have sufficient housing, it's primarily a supply problem. Trying to adjust it with a demand solution of giving people more money for a limited supply works the exact same way. We just end up bidding up the limited supply higher than it otherwise would have been.
That's an excellent analysis. And what politicians don't understand when they try to create these tax credits and deductions, you have to have a tax liability in order to take advantage of a credit or deduction. The tax credit for electric vehicles is $7,500. In order to get the full value of that tax credit, you have to have a tax liability at least as much as $7,500. Well, many people don't, actually. Because of other deductions in the code, their actual tax liability is much smaller. So when you look at the historical record, the IRS data, which I poured through to see what the average value of those electric vehicle tax credits have been, they were less than $5,000. So people were actually getting shortchanged and not getting the full value of the credit because most people don't have a tax liability large enough to take advantage of it. The only people that do, wealthy people, higher income people can get the full value of the credit because they pay more. That's why you see so many high income people with Teslas and whatnot, is because they can afford not only an $80,000 car, but they have a tax liability large enough to take full advantage of that credit.
What about tax-free municipal bonds? I did not know that municipal bonds were tax-free at all. How do those work? Are they a good idea, bad idea? I'm guessing bad idea.
They are a bad idea. Yeah, tax-free municipal bonds are a bad idea from a couple different perspectives. One is, what are they? Well, local governments, communities, can lend out bonds. They can borrow money to purchase infrastructure, to create a sports stadium, to do road work, all of these different things that communities do all the time. They borrow money, and then they get this money in the form of these bonds, and they pay out interest in those bonds, but they don't have. But the recipient, the purchaser of the bond, doesn't have to pay tax on the income that they get from it, which is a great deal. And especially if you're extremely wealthy, you can live on these tax-free bonds and pay no income tax. Well, it's a very expensive way for the federal government to subsidize local projects because the subsidy rate is essentially high enough where communities get if they borrow $100, they are actually not getting $100 worth of borrowing, if you will, of money for the roads. Whereas wealthy people are getting this full deduction. So at the end of the day, it becomes a very expensive way for the government to try to subsidize, local communities. But even more, it truly benefits high-income people. There's a story many years ago about what was their name? And now I've blanked out. but a wealthy person who was just basically living off of these tax-free municipal bonds. And it can, I think, create some rather bad incentives for folks.
Yeah, I think if you had enough, I'm trying to do the math in my head here. If you had a few $1,000,000 in the bank, you had it, that means you have the assets necessary to have a low interest rate because if you wanted to get a bank loan, because they go, well, we can just take your money, so you're not a higher risk. So we'll loan you $100,000 at 0.1% interest or whatever. Then you take that money that you got from the loan, put it in these tax-free municipal bonds, and as long as they outpace the loan, you get free money because you pay back the loan. You don't pay taxes on it. So if you have enough assets, you can just live for free and never have to pay taxes again. That's amazing.
Yep. That's basically how it works.
Okay. I got a new goal. After I form my podcasting nonprofit network and buy a hospital, I'm going to get enough money in the bank that I can start purchasing these municipal free bonds.
There you go. I mean, but think about all this intellectual energy that you're putting into tax avoidance rather than...
I can make a better podcast. Just go straight forward. What about opportunity zones? I'm really not familiar with these, but you mentioned them in the book. What are they and why are you suspicious of them?
Government's been trying to use the tax code to revitalize local poor communities for decades now. It started out with something called enterprise zones. And a lot of this idea came from conservative and free market economists who said, hey, one of the problems that these local communities have is capital. They don't have enough capital. And so if we can encourage people to put capital into these poor communities, they'll revitalize. Well, one of the ways we can incentivize people to put investment or capital into these communities is by not taxing them, creating various tax credits or deductions or what have you, tax exemptions for wealthy investors to put capital into these communities. And we've tried various ways to doing that over the last 30 or 40 years. Enterprise zones was the first. Now we have opportunity zones in which people can invest. They can take money that they've invested elsewhere, put the capital gains into these opportunity zones, and if they leave the money in there long enough, they don't have to pay tax on the capital gains that's accrued on that investment. Well, what it's done actually is not help the people who live in these poor areas, it's helped the developers who invest in these areas, the ones that make the high-rise apartment buildings or the office buildings or the shopping malls and the other things that developers are putting in these communities. And what we find is that actually the jobs and other things that are created in these communities are not coming from local residents. They're coming from the outside. And so it's actually these, what we call place-based incentives, benefit the investors and not the local community. It doesn't encourage the kind of investment that helps real people. It doesn't give them the community centers, the hospitals, the other things that they would more value. Instead, it's encouraging luxury apartment buildings, office buildings, and shopping malls. And so what we find is that if there are instances in which these tax incentives raise, the local wages, it's coming from people who have moved from the outside or commuting in to work in these office buildings. The poor people in these communities, it's not helping them get a better education. It's not reducing necessarily the crime. It's not giving them the networking ability to find a good job. And so they're being left on the outside, and these tax credits are essentially just incentivizing or benefiting wealthy investors and developers.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and I would imagine that property prices also go up, which is going to hurt the poor.
Yes.
And if there are property
and
taxes
it freezes
there,
these people out.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to change tax for a minute, and I'm going to give you 5 different taxes, and I want you to rank them in order of stupidity. So if I were elected president and I'm going to make you the tax czar, and Congress is like Scott Hodge, he's our guy, whatever he says, we're going to do this. So rank these taxes in order of stupidity from dumbest to smartest. Corporate tax, consumption tax, income tax, property tax, carbon tax. What would you get rid of or severely reduce? What would you go? That's going to be where we get the bulk of our funding from.
Yeah, economists have developed over the years in studying the impact of taxes, what you might call a hierarchy of tax harm. And we'll go with yours, most stupid from less stupid.
Uh-huh.
And so it all is based on the mobility of the factor in the economy. And what we find is that capital is the most mobile factor in the economy, and thus the most harmful, most sensitive to high tax rates. And so something like the corporate income tax is the most harmful tax for economic growth because capital is the most mobile factor in the economy. Companies can up and move from one country to the next. They can move their investments or factories and so forth. And so they're the most harmful. Now, people are fairly mobile too, and we can also decide whether we want to work, save, or invest with our hard-earned dollars based on the level of taxation. So an income tax would be second most harmful for economic growth.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay. So wait, again, can I pause you there just for a moment, Scott?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in our interview that you're libertarian, you lean towards low taxes. Me not being an expert in this, it's always hard for me to figure out what is the well-informed but partisan position versus a consensus position. You said that economists have determined this. Broadly speaking, would most economists, even Democrats, agree with you so far that that corporate taxes and income taxes are the least efficient and worse mechanisms of the ones that I outlined? Is there consensus around that?
I think there is. And the real debate about the corporate income tax is not its sensitivity to high taxation. The real debate among economists is who actually bears the economic burden of the corporate income tax. And there are three possible parties, if you will. There's obviously shareholders or the owners of capital. There's workers, and then there's consumers, the people who buy the products that the companies make. Well, a lot of economic research is showing that ultimately it's workers who bear the most of the economic burden of corporate taxation through lower wages. Now, initially, once they raise the tax, shareholders may bear that economic burden, but over the long term, economists are finding more and more that it's workers who will pay lower or benefit from lower wages through a higher corporate tax.
Okay. Well, and on top of that, like this is something I've pointed out for a while that, like, again, no one wants to pay taxes. So if my behemoth nonprofit corporate podcasting enterprise, right, if our nonprofit status is revoked, we become a corporation, and you start saying we're charging really high taxes on corporate stuff. Here's what we're going to do. I'm telling you immediately off the bat what we're going to do. We're not going to have a profit anymore. I'm going to pay all of the top people in it. Me and the other podcast hosts are going to get higher income because we can deduct that from our corporate taxes. And then we're just going to do like fun, like basically we're going to go on vacation. We're going to go to Davos. And we're going to write it off in our taxes because it's a business expense. We're going to buy a nicer building. We're going to have company cars available for people because we're just going to figure out how to shuffle it over to fun stuff because I would rather keep the money in the company doing fun, frivolous stuff than give it to Uncle Sam to piss away on killing people in countries I've never heard of before. So, like, that's just naturally going to happen. You're going to always have a top marginal effective corporate tax rate, which I think is historically around 27%. Like, there's a certain level you can't actually get above because they'll just reinvest it in the company.
There's a lot of historical economic research showing that would exactly happen. There was a tax during the 1930s on retained earnings from corporations because they were trying to encourage companies to pay dividends. So they raised the tax on retained earnings. Well, what did owners and managers do? Well, they pissed away the money. They spent on elaborate bonuses and salaries and capital that they didn't need, equipment they didn't need to minimize their retained earnings, their profits, so that they didn't have to pay tax on it.
Or alternately, maybe we'll just buy a hell of a lot of advertising. That's deductible. It's a business expense. And what happens if we all do it? Then advertising just costs more and you didn't accomplish anything other than driving up a market.
And that's exactly what happened. It's those kind of incentives. So again, you asked me the first question. If you ask if a politician asks what I think of the tax, what are the implications? What are the unintended consequences? And this is one of those. And what the economic research has shown and there was an interesting study done in Germany a couple of years ago on the corporate income tax, and they found that 51% the economic burden of the corporate income tax fell on workers through lower wages, but mostly on the most marginal workers. It was women, low-skilled workers, and the younger workers who were most impacted by those lower wages. So when we think about, the corporate income tax, Elizabeth Warren is out with a paper or a speech today, I think, saying, "Oh, we need higher corporate taxes to get those guys to pay their fair share," and all that stuff. Well, ultimately, that tax is going to fall on workers through lower wages, and it's the most marginal workers who are going to bear that economic burden.
For people like Elizabeth Warren, who share this deep, old, ancient, medieval worldview that prices increase because of greed, I would posit that a corporation run by evil, greedy people, if that's the beginning premise on this, is going to be least incentivized by higher corporate taxes to lower dividends. If I am the CEO of this evil company, and I am evil and I am greedy, we're just accepting all of this, that all CEOs are bad. Okay, am I going to, when given higher corporate tax rates, am I going to go, damn it, I guess I'll take a pay cut? That's the only thing we're going to change. No, I'm evil and greedy. I'm not going to do that. Am I going to lower the amount of dividends going out in the stocks? Well, I'm more likely to get fired by the board of directors if I do that, because they're all also evil and greedy and they want all the money. So where am I going to try and squeeze it? I'm either going to squeeze it on the consumer end by raising prices so I can keep dividends the same, or I'm going to fire people and automate them. So if this is based on people being evil and punishing the corporations for their avarice, it's still going to have a negative effect that's an antisocial effect not intended.
It's interesting, too, that people like Elizabeth Warren are beginning to use high tax rates on both corporations and individuals, much like sin taxes. So wealth is the new sin tax, or wealth taxes are the new sin tax. These are taxes on success. And so
great thing to discourage, by the way. You really want to discourage success in an economy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, oh, well, okay. Let's see now. We understand that if we use taxes to keep people from smoking, they stop smoking or drinking or doing all these other sinful things. Wow, let's use income taxes to discourage people from creating wealth, investing, and being successful. Well, does that make any sense whatsoever? No. But that's the mentality, and it comes either from envy or some sort of distorted view of somehow I think that they either think that wealthy people either have too much political power, too much economic power, or something. And it's also, they have this thing about inequality. Well, we have too much inequality. If we tax the hell out of people, we're going to get less inequality. Well, it doesn't actually work that way.
I think it boils down to understanding economics as a morality play rather than an amoral system that involves levers and outcomes. If it's a morality play, what you need to do is who's the white hat, who's the black hat. And I think pretty much all of Elizabeth Warren's economics that I've paid attention to the last 20 years, her whole setup is spot the bad guy, stop the bad guy. That's it. It's identify who's the bad actor, end the bad actor. But it all boils down to this morality play and understanding economics through an ethically valenced lens of who is good and who is bad. And to me, that is very similar to like making decisions about electrical systems on whether we should go with AC or DC power based on which one's more kind. Like there is a morality is important, ethics are important. I'm not a nihilist, but they don't apply to all fields. Some fields are amoral, and with economics, you need to be thinking more about incentives and outcomes than you should be thinking about good guys, bad guys. But I digress. Let's move on to income tax. You hinted on that. Of the ones that I mentioned, corporate taxes and income taxes are bad. Income taxes are pretty bog standard in the United States, throughout the developed world, Western Europe. It would be a very, very big shift to move away from income taxes. I assume that the majority of tax revenue for the federal government is through income taxes.
Indeed.
So why are they bad? That seems like a fairly straightforward tax.
It is. It's certainly historical. Here in the United States, we lean on it very heavily. But high income taxes discourage success, discourage investment, discourage savings, and discourage work effort. Why do we want to discourage those kinds of things? And so that's why a lot of economics is showing that we want to move toward a consumption-based tax. And there are different ways to get there from here. And I spend the last part of the book going through different tax options, and some are quite familiar to people, like the flat tax, which is a consumed income tax, if you will. What the flat tax does is it doesn't tax your savings or investment. So ultimately what it's taxing is the income that you consume with. Then you have things like the fair tax.
I thought a flat tax was just everybody pays the same level of income tax, which I think I'm opposed to. I'm fine with there being a progressive income tax. That doesn't bother me. But the flat tax that you're outlining, that is more of not taxing savings and capital as opposed to just taxing everybody one rate.
Yeah, when we think of the flat tax, we think about the rate because it was originally posed at 20% on everybody over a certain income level or a standard deduction. But the flatness of it is really about the tax base. And that is creating a flat tax base or a neutral tax base, one that's neutral to savings and investment. So the whole idea of a flat tax was to not tax your savings, not tax your piggy banks, not tax your investment, because when we save and we invest, we're doing so with after-tax income. And so you don't want to tax it a second time. And so once you've exempted both our income and our investment from the tax base, all you're taxing is essentially the money that we use to consume. And that's essentially a consumption tax, but it gets there in a little bit round way. What we mostly think about when we think of consumption taxes are things like the fair tax, which is a national retail sales tax, or a value-added tax, which is what the Europeans use. And again, that's a consumption tax that's on products and it's built into the price of the product, but it also is just simply a tax on our consumption. And there are different ways that you can get from here to there, but that's the basic idea, is to move away from taxing income to just simply taxing consumption. And that's the most economically efficient and neutral way of raising revenues for the federal government.
Okay, so there's parts of a consumption tax that I like, and there are parts that worry me. The part that I like is that I think that you would probably get a lot less tax evasion. So if I am whatever that horrible gang is, M6 or whatever, and I've got a affiliate in Kansas, and we're buying speedboats, and we're buying guns, and we're going to pay taxes on that. Whereas right now, most drug dealers don't report their taxes very accurately. If I'm a very wealthy person and I buy a yacht, I am paying taxes on the yacht, as opposed to buying municipal bonds and things like that. So it does seem to me that you're gonna catch a lot of people that are in tax avoidance right now because you're catching them at the point of sales as opposed to through the complicated tax structure that we've already discussed. I like that bit. The part that worries me about it is, are sales taxes not inherently regressive? That seems to be the pushback on sales taxes, that that if you're earning $300,000 a year, paying an extra 20% on bagels doesn't really affect you that much. But if you're earning $20,000 a year, you're disproportionately feeling the impact of sales taxes. So would that not end up being just a massive shift in the burden to poor people and disproportionately affecting them?
Yeah, that's the common perception of consumption taxes, that they are regressive. And I think there's mixed, intuitively that sounds like the case. But wealthy people do spend a lot as well. And so it becomes out fairly proportional. The problem is that in some cases, like as I was mentioning in England, where they zero rate taxing food rather than snacks, you get into these sort of distortions. A lot of countries and will try to reduce the regressive nature of consumption taxes by zero rating or not taxing things like food or medicine and what have you.
Right.
And that gets into all kinds of problems when you do that. There's always going to be issues with every tax.
Yeah.
And you have to, it's all a matter of trade-offs. And, as Thomas Sowell once wrote, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs.
Right.
And so we have to just kind of figure, what are the trade-offs? From an economic standpoint, not taxing a poor person's income is pretty good. And maybe just, if they pay tax on their consumption, they're actually better off because they're not being discouraged from working and getting rich and saving. They're just simply being discouraged from consuming.
Okay, which by and large, if we accept the premise as I do, that you're going to get less of that which you tax, I would rather discourage people from buying stuff and encourage saving than discourage earning money and discourage saving. And as you point out, if we have income taxes and we have capital gains taxes, like by global standards, I am wealthy. By American standards, I'm doing okay. So when I purchase stock, when I put it in an ETF or I put it in a Vanguard fund or whatever, I'm using my income to do that. I didn't inherit it. I'm working. I'm getting it from the podcast. I put it in it, and then I am now taxed when I remove it. So I'm being taxed on the proceeds from a thing that I had to work to invest in. That's something that could potentially discourage people from saving. And by and large, you want to have more savings in an economy because that leads to capital, that leads to growth. So I'd rather tax people on consumption. That does make sense to me. But I guess your other point, Scott, is very salient in that there's not a silver bullet. It's not that we arrive at a permanent solution where we go, we fixed it. All we had to do was figure out the best kind of tax. Now no one cares. Now no one wants to avoid paying taxes. That's always going to be there. So if we said anything you purchase in a grocery store is tax exempt, you would immediately start seeing Rolexes sold in grocery stores. If we said that in anything that is medicine is tax exempt, you would find a lot of products that right now are not medicine that suddenly have 1% laudanum or whatever, so that, this soda is a medicinal soda. There's going to be that stuff. But overall, what you're saying is that the distortions, the complications, and the maladaptive incentive structure for income tax and corporate tax is going to be a net negative compared to a consumption tax. That a consumption tax with all its problems is still a more direct, neutral, simple way of administering a tax base.
That's right. And that there are academics that have proposed, might call it contradictory, but a progressive consumption tax. And one variant is called the X tax for some reason. But anyway, they have a progressive rate structure in it. But they also have a very large, what you might call family allowance or standard deduction. So it's protecting the poor, but it's then taxing upper income people at a higher rate. But the good thing is it doesn't tax savings and investment. So it is neutral in that regard. Now, when we look globally and say, well, what's the ideal tax system out there? Because obviously the United States is far from that. The little country of Estonia, they're up in the Baltics, has what we would consider the most economically neutral tax system, and it's really cool in a couple different ways. It's a variant of a flat tax. Most of the rates are all 20%, so the income tax is 20%, the capital gains rate is 20%, the value-added tax is 20%, and the corporate income tax is 20%. The interesting thing about it is that the corporate income tax is only applied when a company distributes its profits to shareholders, so we can retain those earnings, invest it back in the company, and then when it pays out those dividends, then it's taxed at 20%. The recipient, the shareholder, does not pay a second level of tax on those dividends, so it's only taxed once, and then it's taxed at that 20% rate. So it's a very, very neutral tax system. It's very, very conducive to entrepreneurship. There's a lot of high-tech companies that have been developed there cater to the European market because it is such a good place for technology-oriented companies to start up. And so they have a lot of companies that start small and get very large very quickly because it's such a capital neutral country to invest in.
Okay, great. That sounds like a good plan. I will look more into that. Picking on another one, you mentioned in the book something called I want to say like a universal savings account that other countries are playing around with. What are those?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Sadly, in the United States, members of Congress, politicians have tried to incentivize us they encourage us to save, but they've done so in so many ways that we have to take our dollar and split it up into 15 different things. So we have savings accounts for retirement, for healthcare, for education, or whatnot, and plus passbook savings accounts. So rather than have all these different savings accounts, why not just have one that you can put your money in for whatever reason that you can save for the future? And Great Britain and Canada have these universal savings accounts in which you can put up to, in some cases, like $25,000 a year. You can withdraw it in the future for any reason, and the income that is generated by it is not taxed again because you're putting in after-tax dollars, so you've already paid tax on those savings. And it's very, very popular among working-class people, and they have taken off in both Canada and Great Britain. And we're encouraging members of Congress to look at these things here in the United States because savings is good. We all know that. Having that piggy bank when we're a kid is what teaches us about the value of thrift and savings. Unfortunately, we've gone overboard in trying to encourage savings by having too many places to save with too many rules and too much complication. And so by having something like this universal savings account, we can simplify things and put the responsibility and the choice on people as to how to use their savings rather than what politicians have dictated how we use our savings.
Out of curiosity, would that universal savings account include stock? And the reason I ask that is that's a potential way to get around paying a lot of taxes. If I let's say am doing pretty well and I put in my retirement fund, but then I open up a universal savings account and I purchase like risky stock, but if it takes off, I don't have to pay any taxes on it. So is that something that they're dealing with?
Well, it would be much like a Roth IRA where you put in after-tax dollars into the investment, and then you don't pay tax on the investment buildup. So they're really very, very simple. Yes, the decision would have to be made. How much could people? Where would they invest? I think the rules in both Canada and Great Britain are fairly lax, but I think that those are political decisions. I'd rather put fewer rules than more. I'd rather have politicians keep their hands off our piggy banks rather than trying to dictate how we should invest those dollars.
Well, I'll add, as somebody that I've finally started saving in any amount, I a little bit when I worked in New York, but really the last 2 years are the first years that I've been able to significantly put any money into my retirement account. I'm now 40. So there's I'm just now kind of doing this, and I'm looking at, hey, if I were to buy a house, how much money do I have to it? And I thought, well, maybe I could use my retirement account where most of my assets are to, nope, turns out, no, I'd have to pay a penalty and all of that. It would be much more useful to me as a non-wealthy consumer to have one account that I could theoretically use for retirement, I could theoretically use for a home, I could use for medical expenses, that is just sort of available to me, because I would prefer to adjudicate that myself. And instead of having to do this weird shell game of, okay, I'm going to start putting money in an HSA because I think maybe I'll make it to 90, and it's pre-tax, so if I have a lot of medical expenses, I can, I'd rather just have it in a big lump sum that I can use for my own purposes.
Oh, I know. And again, if you believe in free will, you should be for something like a universal savings accounts, because our current tax code goes against free will. It's telling us how to save our money and how we can spend those savings. It's not giving us the choice in how to do that. And we want to move toward a tax system that's conducive to free will. It recognizes that we should be the drivers of how we use our money, how we use our income, and not have to conform to what politicians have told us how we can save, how we can invest, how we can spend our dollars. It just, all of the some 220 different credits, deductions, and exemptions in the tax code are all designed around political needs, not our own.
So we've established that corporate taxes and income taxes are probably the most counterproductive and complex taxes, that consumption taxes, for whatever their problems, are going to be superior. By process of elimination, I also inferred that you would prefer property tax compared to the other ones that we've discussed so far. Why is that?
Land is the least mobile factor in the economy and thus less sensitive to high tax rates. Now, keep in mind that this ranking of tax stupidity or tax harm is a relative one. So all of these taxes, corporate income tax, personal income tax, consumption taxes, and even property taxes have economic consequences. People will do things to avoid them, but this is a relative scale and not an absolute one. There's a number of stories in the book of how investors and people have avoided property taxes. In the early 1500s, property in France was taxed on the square footage of the property. So people built the second story on a house to be larger than the footprint of the property, and therefore they got a tax-free second story. Mansard roofs in Paris, if you've ever been to Paris, these beautiful mansard roofs were all designed to avoid taxation because taxes were applied to the height of the home up to the roof level. Well, if you had a setback attic, if you will, for a mansard roof, that was tax-free. If you look in Amsterdam, for instance, all the properties their buildings are very narrow and very tall. That's because they tax buildings on the square footage of the frontage. So to avoid the property tax, people built narrow and tall buildings. And so this has been the case, throughout history, and the way that people have tried to avoid property taxes. But that said, relatively speaking, they're less harmful than either corporate income taxes, or consumption taxes.
Delightful. So I always enjoy on the program when a guest introduces some cognitive dissonance that makes me think, but I like it even more when my stuff's confirmed. So I am like an unabashed Georgist. I think the Georgists were right. I think land value taxes are a great idea. The basic idea on that being that, look, like you shouldn't penalize people. You shouldn't disincentivize people from developing things. You shouldn't go, you're going to be penalized for building a building or for selling stuff on a plot of land or for earning income on it. I am fine taxing you on something you had nothing to do with the creation of. So land that's closer to a beautiful river is going to be worth more than land that's in a flat area not near the river. You didn't have anything to do with that. Or let's say society did it, where we build a subway stop over in Craighurst or something, some part of New York, and now the land around it is more valuable, not because of anything you did. I don't want to punish anybody for the house that you've built or the corporation you've built or the factory or anything like that. I want to incentivize you to build a beautiful house and a business, but for the stuff that you have nothing to do with, mineral rights, access to water, things like that are God-given or society-given, that's the stuff that I'd rather focus on taxing. And it would also, I think, be better at compelling people to more efficiently use those resources. So like whenever I bring this up, people get really worried about farmers. Great news. Most farms are not in downtown areas in a city. Most farms, and I've got some experience with this, they're actually in like relatively flat places that we call big sky country. And big sky means nothing else going for it. That's what it means when we say big sky country. So you're not going to get taxed at a high rate. You're going to get taxed at like, 5 cents an acre or something. You don't need to worry about that putting farmers out of business. Again, unless they have some weird like botanical garden, like upright botanical garden downtown Manhattan, then yeah, maybe. But maybe that would be better served some other way. So, okay, great. So it sounds like consumption taxes and land value property taxes are a better way to organize a tax base than corporate taxes and income taxes.
Yes.
Okay. I brought up carbon taxes, which I feel like are kind of tertiary, but where would you put that in the mix?
Yeah, that's more of a consumption tax.
Okay.
Right in that, much like a value-added tax, because it's really taxing the things that we buy and make. And again, it's, you might call it a sin tax because what it's trying to do is discourage carbon and things that are made with carbon, and force people or incentivize people to find less carbon-intensive ways of both making things and the products that they make. And so many economists would say this is a much more efficient way to try to deal with global warming or carbon pollution than things like the regulatory apparatus that creates so many distortions. Because what a carbon tax does is it uses sort of market incentives, the price theory, to encourage people to find less distortive ways of creating these products.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Although the thing that I would add that you beautifully point out in the book is that sin taxes cannot simultaneously be designed to discourage a behavior and encourage revenue for government. So like if I say we're going to have a tobacco tax because we got to get people to quit smoking, and great news, it's going to fund education, there's a problem here, because the better it is at funding education, the more ineffective it is at discouraging the behavior we don't want. If it actually works and people quit smoking, we don't have any funding for education. So these are mutually exclusive aims that are being used by the tax. So carbon tax good as a discouraging mechanism, not good as a fundraising mechanism.
And the same message goes to Elizabeth Warren on her wealth tax. How can you have, expect to raise billions of dollars from a wealth tax while discouraging the creation of wealth?
Yeah. Well, and on top of that too, like I would think a wealth tax would be even harder to administer than like if we're working out of things that are just not good, that are complex policies. So like, let's say theoretically the Heaton family that I'm a member of, somehow we have a Van Gogh painting in our possession. Like my great aunt had an affair with Van Gogh, and right before he died, he gave her a painting, and we have it. It's a cherished heirloom in the family, but otherwise we're not particularly wealthy. Our assets are then $30 million. So like do we every year do we get taxed based on that till we get rid of this painting? And if so, what benefit was it? Was inequality really served by the Heaton family having a Van Gogh painting? Did that really make the world worse? And I also, on top of that, you think about like the amount of effort people go into trying to avoid taxes right now, trying to figure out how to game your estate to look like it doesn't have much money in it, the amount of warping you would have, the amount of like weird, like putting all of my assets in art and then having the art ranked as poor, like it would, I don't think it would even work, or it would work very poorly.
You would need a national or global asset registry that everyone would have to pony up a list, an inventory of their assets each and every year and come up with some sort of a value to put on it. And then you would have to pay tax on it. It is completely insane. And that's why that fewer and fewer countries every year are enacting these kinds of wealth taxes. Norway is a good example of what can go wrong. Norway has a wealth tax. They increased, almost doubled their wealth tax rate in 2022, and they've seen an exodus of wealthy millionaires and billionaires moving out of the country to low-tax countries such as Switzerland.
Yeah.
And therefore, the country's fiscal house, their budget, is underwater because not only have people taken their wealth with them, they took their tax with them as well. And so the country is raising less revenues from. So look, there's always consequences to these things, and because incentives matter, and wealthy people, capital, can be very, very mobile.
So I'll run a couple more questions at you, and then we'll finish up. We've been really wailing on Elizabeth Warren. I'd like to wail on Bernie Sanders for a moment.
Why not? Yeah.
Bernie Sanders in the past has proposed a financial transaction tax. I'm assuming that is a bad idea. Why is that a bad idea? And what is it of which he speaks?
Yeah, a financial transaction tax, many people think would be the perfect tax because it's taxed. The rate is very, very low, and it's on a very broad base. And we often hear that as a mantra. Yes, tax rates should be low and it should be on a broad base. So if we're going to tax every financial transaction at like a half a penny each, we're going to raise billions and we'll notice it. Well, it doesn't work that way. And so what we see is when other countries have tried these kinds of things, Sweden is a good example that put a tax on financial transactions, stock transactions. They saw a lot of their stock transactions or their part of their stock exchange move to places like London, which didn't have such a tax. Or we've seen other distortions where in France, where they were taxing financial transactions over a certain amount, those kinds of trades move to other, the lesser valued trades move to other countries as a result. So there's always, even with a low rate and a broad base, there are going to be distortions from these kinds of taxes. And especially what these people don't really understand is how mobile capital is and how quickly it can move based on the rate of taxation. And so if we implemented a financial transactions tax or some sort of a stock, transactions tax, you'd see a lot of transactions move out of the New York Stock Exchange to London or, Hong Kong or somewhere else.
And then one more, I don't know if this is Bernie Sanders, but it sounds like Bernie Sanders, a windfall tax where you have excessive, by the way, this is straight up Thomas Aquinas. This is absolute dark age thinking. I'll hang my hat on this. You ought to make a little bit of money and then stop. If you're making beyond 3% or 5%, that's excessive profit. You were being avaristic. You were being greedy. Excessive profit, we will tax. So what would you say to somebody proposing a windfall tax?
Oh, we hear this every time that oil prices go up. Oh, these companies are making these huge windfalls. They made the investment, and now they're getting these huge windfalls because the price has gone up to $100 a barrel, so they're making a fortune. Or you heard this during COVID. Oh, these medical companies are making a fortune now off of selling things that used to be cheap, and now because of COVID, they're making fortunes, so we got to tax them on the windfall. These kind of taxes end up having, again, unintended consequences. And first and foremost, you cannot tell the difference between a normal tax or normal profits and supernormal profits or windfall profits. What's the difference? You can't. There's no distinguishing characteristic.
There's no innate chemical reaction that scientists can look at and say, well, we all know 5% is reasonable, but 8% is too high. It's an arbitrary gradient.
Yeah. Where does price gouging begin? And it's sort of like, I guess, pornography, where politicians, they know it when they see it, and therefore they're going to tax it. Well, we have a lot of history to show that these kind of taxes have really bad consequences. This was tried at the end of the Jimmy Carter administration when they passed an oil surtax or profits tax. It led actually to a reduction in domestic production and an increase in imported oil, and the amount of revenues that came from that tax dwindled each and every year. So it fell way short of what was expected. So again, the attempt to try to tax these so-called windfall profits led to unintended consequences contrary to what was actually intended. And that was a reduction in domestic production and an increase in imports, which it was supposed to prevent.
I would be more worried about the effect that it would have on innovation. And
yes.
by that I mean let's go back to I've had an illustrious career. I've gone from podcasting nonprofit tycoon to corporate tax evader to, at some point I owned a hospital. Now I'm an inventor, and I've got $15 million in the bank from all of my previous exploits. I've got $15 million. I'm evil and greedy. My goal is just to maximize the amount of money coming into me, and there's a windfall tax, meaning that if I have any business that, let's say, generates more than 15% profit, I'm going to have to pay excessive taxes on it. Okay, well, absent that windfall tax, I might do some really crazy shit. Like I might, with 15 million, I might go, if I've got this idea for a solar powered car where we've got an idea for really good solar technology. We could actually just have a self-filling car. And if we got that off the hook, like if we got that to work, we're looking at, 400% profit for years until the industry catches up with us. I might actually develop that technology. But if a windfall profit tax comes on, and I go, it's just going to be taken away if I do that. And again, I'm evil and greedy in this scenario. I'm not doing it out of the goodness of my heart. I'm just going to open up a gravel company. Like if I know that I'm going to be punished if I make anything more than 3%. Well, if I'm now going to be penalized for the excess profits that I make, I'm going to shift my attention to the least risky form of business I can do, which means that I'm going to avoid innovation. I'm going to avoid any type of risk. But I don't want the public sector making really risky stuff, but I do want the private sector doing risky stuff all the time because they end up eating the costs of it. But when they don't eat the costs and they end up developing, an iPhone that sucks humidity out and makes the world less humid and whatever, and they make money on it, great. That incentivizes more stuff.
Makes Austin more livable.
Yes. Yes. That's the ultimate goal of all of this, Scott, is just to make the temperature and humidity in Texas less horrible that it is. Well, tell you what, I'm going to wrap it up there. I apologize to you, Scott. I got carried away and I lost track of the time. I think we went over by, looks like a solid 30 minutes. Apologies for that, but I very much enjoyed talking to you. Yeah, we went about
This has been a blast. Come on. This has been fun.
So two things. One, the book that we've been discussing is Taxocracy, What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life by Scott Hodge. This is one of those books where I'd say we probably covered about half of it, maybe 60% of it in broad strokes. There's still a significant amount we just didn't have time for. If you were interested in the conversation we just had, you will like the book. It is a readable book. It has lots of scenarios. It's actually very much designed for podcast hosts because every chapter has takeaways in it that I can look at and go, oh, great, I'll use that as a question. Thank you, Scott. So it's a good book. Then the other thing I'll throw out, Scott, feel free to turn this down. I'll cut it off if you don't want to do this. I do a bonus episode on the show every week. Would you mind coming back to do a bonus episode where I just ask you weird questions about stuff that is potentially tax exempt? Like I want to, like for example, I'm curious, can exotic dancers deduct breast implants? Like that kind of thing. I just want to ask you questions about that. You're up for that?
Indeed they can. And yes, that would be a fun bonus round.
Okay, great. Then absolutely. I will, off camera, we'll work out a time for that. So listeners, by the time you hear this episode, Scott and I will have already recorded a bonus episode that will be me asking about weird deductions like breast implants and also really just using him for tax advice on all of the scams that he wants to get rid of that I can take advantage of. So that'll be this week's bonus episode. Scott Hodge, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. It's been fun.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. One bad thing that came out of this episode is apparently I can't just flip a switch and rebrand myself a nonprofit, because I was actually considering that at one point. And someday, if I ever come into a lot of money, I do want to create the Heaton Institute of Unsuspicious Activity, because I think the Heaton Institute of Unsuspicious Activity is a really, really funny name for a think tank and/or ball pit. I don't know what it would be other than a tax evading mechanism. But based on what Scott says, I can't do that as a sole proprietor as I am now. I'd have to get a board of directors and stuff and have them determine my salary. All of which means I cannot yet get a handful of billionaires to fund my opulent camping lifestyle through tax-deductible donations. So I guess you and I are stuck with each other. Sorry. Please go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Let me give you 3 reasons why you should support the show. First, honestly, I want you to answer this question for yourself. I can't hear you. You're in your car or doing laundry, possibly on the toilet. In any event, this is just in your own head. Was this one of the most entertaining and informative conversations about taxes you've ever heard in your entire life? As in, when you click off today's episode, are you going to feel exhausted and dumb? Or are you going to feel smarter and a little bit happier despite kicking off with a shipwreck and discussing taxes? If we did that, if the political orphanage pulled that off discussing tax law, isn't it worth supporting? Second, if you're unmoved by that, you're one of the evil, greedy people we kept mentioning on today's program, utterly and totally moved by self-interest, let me make you a pitch. If you're a patron of the show, you get bonus content. Earlier this summer, I talked to a gonzo journalist friend of mine about LSD trips. And as you just heard this week, I'm going to talk to Scott further about more colorful, fun things than we did today. The dessert to today's meal, like if strippers can deduct breast implants from their taxes. And also, honestly, a lot of what I'm going to talk to them about, I haven't spoken to them yet. What kind of rich people tax loopholes can I get in on? Yeah, we all want to get rid of the bad tax system. That's why I did the episode. It's the entire point of the episode. But until we do, I want to get in on that gravy train. I might as well get in on the graft until I'm able to get rid of the graft. So that's going to be this week's bonus episode. Some amount of breast implant deductions versus graft for Heaton. But there are hundreds of more episodes in the tank that are bonus episodes. Finally, reason number 3 to support the show on Patreon. If you don't support the political orphanage, in a way, aren't you really supporting Al-Qaeda? I mean, I hate to say it, but it's what we're all thinking, right? If you don't support the political orphanage, you're basically on Team Al-Qaeda, as far as I'm concerned. So be better than that. You are better than that. Deep down, You want to be an elite patron. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Scott Hodge, for coming on to discuss smart and stupid taxes. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode and is, for tax purposes, simultaneously 3 separate 14-year-old twins I deduct through the child tax credit system. Finally, thank you, patrons of the show. Don't worry, someday we'll figure out how to deduct all of this, and you and me are going to get rich together and live on a big old, non-sinkable Welsh gold boat. Yep, I'm done thinking. That was it. You just heard the sound of Heaton's brain hit E. So until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.